June 24th, 1340. The coast of Flanders. A forest of masts rose from the harbour at Sluys. Over 200 French warships packed so tightly together that they looked like a floating city. King Philip VI of France had assembled the mightiest naval force in Europe, and it had one purpose: invade England, crush the upstart King Edward III, and end the war before it truly began. England's coasts were burning. French raiders had already sacked Southampton, torched Portsmouth, and captured Edward's finest ships. Now, the greatest armada since ancient times was preparing to cross the Channel and conquer England itself. But Edward wasn't waiting to be invaded. He was coming to them, with half as many ships, a weapon the French had never faced at sea, and a thirst for revenge that would turn the waters red. What happened next was so devastating that no one at the French court dared tell their king. When he finally learned the truth, it took a court jester to break the news, because everyone else was too terrified to speak. This is the story of Sluys. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a battle that deserves to be as famous as Trafalgar, but has been largely forgotten. A medieval naval engagement. So one-sided, it changed the course of European history. Because Sluys wasn't just about ships and tactics, it was about England establishing naval dominance that would define its destiny for centuries to come. But before we get to that blood-soaked harbour, before we watch English arrows darken the sky over French decks, we need to understand how these two kingdoms came to blows. Because without knowing the stakes, why Edward believed he had the right to the French crown itself, you can't appreciate why both sides were willing to fight to the death in the waters off Flanders. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Sluys. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1328, when the French king Charles IV died without a male heir. The question of succession threw Europe into crisis. Edward III of England, through his mother Isabella, who was Charles IV's sister, had a strong claim to the French throne. He was the closest male relative. By the laws of inheritance that governed English succession, Edward should have been king of both England and France. But the French nobility had other ideas. They invented a convenient legal principle called Salic law, which supposedly forbade inheritance through the female line. Instead of Edward, they crowned Philip of Valois as King Philip VI. Edward, just 15 years old at the time, was forced to accept this humiliation. He even did homage to Philip for his French territories in Aquitaine. But he never forgot, and he never forgave. For 9 years, tensions simmered. Philip supported Scotland against England. Edward harboured French rebels. Trade disputes festered. And then, in 1337, Philip VI made his move. He declared Edward's French territories forfeit and prepared to seize them by force. Edward's response was audacious. He declared himself the rightful King of France. The 100 Years' War had begun. But in those early years, France held every advantage. Philip VI had a massive fleet, galleys from Genoa, warships from Castile, and the entire naval might of Normandy and the Channel ports. This fleet didn't just threaten English shipping, it terrorized England's coastline. In 1338, French raiders burned Portsmouth to the ground. They sacked Southampton while the townspeople were at church, slaughtering anyone who resisted. Hastings was attacked. The Channel Islands fell. French ships even captured two of Edward's finest vessels, the great cogs Christopher and Edward, killing their crews without mercy. England was under siege from the sea. French raiders struck wherever they pleased, burning coastal towns, capturing merchant ships, disrupting the vital wool trade with Flanders. One French commander, Nicolas Béhuchet, became particularly notorious for his brutality. At the Battle of Arnemuiden in 1338, he ordered the massacre of English prisoners rather than holding them for ransom. England's coast lived in fear. Think about that for a moment. Your towns are burning. Your ships are being captured. Enemy fleets appear without warning, kill your people, and sail away before anyone can respond. Would you wait for them to invade, or would you take the fight to them? Edward chose to fight. What would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. By 1340, Philip VI decided to end the war decisively. He assembled the Grande Armée de la Mer, the Great Army of the Sea, at the Flemish port of Sluys. This wasn't just a fleet, it was an invasion force. Over 200 ships, perhaps 18,000 sailors and soldiers. The plan was simple: destroy any English fleet that dared cross the Channel, then transport a French army to conquer England itself. Philip believed the war would be over by autumn. Sluys was the perfect staging point. It was then considered the finest harbour in Europe, a deep inlet on the Zwin estuary that could shelter hundreds of ships. The French fleet under Admiral Hugues Quiéret and Constable Nicolas Béhuchet. Yes, the same Béhuchet who had massacred English prisoners, arrived in early June. They blockaded the estuary, cutting English communications with Flanders and daring Edward to do something about it. Edward did something about it. Despite warnings from his advisors, despite being told the French fleet was too powerful to challenge, Edward assembled every ship he could find. England had no royal navy in the modern sense. Instead, the king relied on merchant vessels conscripted into military service. These were cogs, broad-beamed cargo ships designed for carrying wool and wine, not fighting battles. But English shipwrights worked frantically, adding wooden castles fore and aft where archers could stand, converting peaceful traders into floating fortresses. By June 22nd, Edward had gathered between 120 and 150 ships at the River Orwell. It was, as historian Jonathan Sumption notes, truly remarkable. A fleet assembled from nothing in mere weeks. But it was still outnumbered nearly 2-1. What Edward had that the French lacked was something that would prove decisive. Approximately 4,000 longbowmen, the deadliest soldiers in Europe. Edward boarded his flagship, the cog Thomas, on the evening of June 21st. The next morning, the English fleet set sail. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 23rd, they sighted the French fleet at Sluys. What Edward saw must have been both terrifying and exhilarating. The French ships were packed so densely into the harbour mouth that their masts looked like a forest. One chronicler wrote that Edward saw such a number of masts that it looked like a wood. That night, Edward sent scouts ashore, including the legendary knights Sir John Chandos and Sir Reginald Cobham, to reconnoitre the French position. What they reported was both alarming and encouraging. The French had arranged their ships in 3 defensive lines across the harbour entrance, chained together to form floating platforms. This made each line virtually immovable, a wall of ships that would be impossible to sail around. But it also meant the French couldn't maneuver. They'd surrendered mobility for mass. The French commanders had made a catastrophic mistake, and they knew it. The Genoese Admiral Pietro Barbavera, commanding the mercenary galleys, begged Chiere and Behuche to put to sea, to fight in open water where their superior numbers could tell. "If you remain here," he warned, "the English, who have the wind, the tide, and the sun behind them, will pen you in and you will be unable to maneuver." The French admirals refused. They were confident their floating fortress was impregnable. On the morning of June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist, battle was joined. Edward spent the morning maneuvering his fleet, waiting for the tide to turn and the sun to move behind his ships. It was classic tactical thinking. He wanted wind, tide, and sun all working in his favor. The French, watching from their anchored positions, thought the English were hesitating, perhaps even retreating. "They are turning tail," some cried. "They are not men enough to fight us." They were catastrophically wrong. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the English fleet attacked. Edward had arranged his ships in a devastating formation. Each group consisted of one ship packed with men-at-arms flanked by 2 ships filled with longbowmen. The archers would sweep enemy decks with arrows. The men-at-arms would board and finish the job. The English longbow was the medieval equivalent of a machine gun. A trained archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute at ranges up to 300 yards, 3 times the rate, and significantly outranging the crossbows the French relied upon. As the English ships closed with the first French line, thousands of arrows darkened the sky. One London longbowman who survived the battle reported that the English arrows fell like hail in winter. The effect on the packed French decks was devastating. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The French crossbowmen tried to return fire, but they were hopelessly outmatched. A crossbow could manage 2 bolts per minute against the longbow's 10. Before a French crossbowman could reload, 5 English arrows were already in the air. The first ship the English targeted was the Christopher, Edward's own captured flagship, now serving the French with 400 crossbowmen aboard. The irony was deliberate. English archers poured fire into the Christopher's decks until the screaming stopped. Then English men-at-arms swarmed aboard, killing anyone still standing. Within an hour, the Christopher was English again, her longbowmen now firing into the French ships alongside her. Ship by ship, the first French line was destroyed. The tactic was always the same. English archers would shoot until resistance collapsed. Then men-at-arms would board with swords and axes, grappling hooks holding the ships together while the killing continued. There was no subtlety, no complex maneuvering, just arrows, then blades, then blood. The French chaining their ships together, which had seemed so clever, became a death trap. Ships that might have fled were held in place by the chains, forced to absorb the arrow storm until the English were ready to board. Men who tried to escape to neighbouring vessels found themselves in the path of English archers who had captured those vessels minutes before. There was nowhere to run. Edward III fought in the thick of it. The king was no armchair commander. He led boarding parties personally, his royal standard visible from across the fleet. At some point during the battle, a crossbow bolt struck him in the thigh. He refused to leave his ship, refused to stop fighting. His wound would take weeks to heal, but he stayed on the Thomas until the battle was won. The fighting raged for nearly 7 hours, from mid-afternoon until after dark. As the first French line collapsed, the English pushed into the second line, which was so tightly packed that ships couldn't even turn to face the attackers. The carnage was appalling. Men died by the thousands, shot, stabbed, drowned, or beaten to death in the press of bodies. 2 ships fought on through the night, their crews refusing to surrender, even as the battle was clearly lost. When dawn came, the English finally overwhelmed them. But by then, the French fleet had ceased to exist. And then the Flemings arrived. The people of Flanders, who had been watching the battle from shore, saw which way it was going. 8,000 Flemish militiamen launched boats into the estuary and fell upon the French third line from behind. They killed anyone who made it to shore. French sailors who swam for land were clubbed to death on the beaches. Those who surrendered were massacred anyway. The Flemings had suffered under French occupation. They showed no mercy. The casualties tell the story. The English lost perhaps 400 to 600 men. The French lost between 16,000 and 20,000, virtually their entire force. Of over 200 French ships, only a handful escaped. The Genoese admiral, Barbavera, managed to extract his galleys when he saw the battle was lost, but almost everyone else died or was captured. Both French admirals met grim ends. Hugues Quiret was captured badly wounded and immediately beheaded, revenge for his role in the coastal raids. Nicolas Béhuchet, the butcher of Arnemuiden, was brought before King Edward on the deck of the Thomas. Béhuchet probably expected to be ransomed, as was customary for noble prisoners. Instead, Edward remembered the massacred English crews, the burned towns, the terror Béhuchet had inflicted on England's coasts. The king ordered him hanged from his own ship's mast, his body left to swing as a warning. The English joked afterward that if the fish in Sluys harbour could speak, they would speak French, from feasting on so many French corpses. Bodies washed up on the Flemish beaches for weeks. The tides ran red. It was, by any measure, the bloodiest naval battle of the medieval era. Here's a question worth considering. Béhuchet had massacred English prisoners 2 years earlier. Edward hanged him in revenge. Was this justice or brutality? The laws of war in the 14th century were fluid. Ransoming prisoners was customary, but not required. Did Béhuchet's previous actions forfeit his right to mercy? Or should Edward have been the bigger man? There's no easy answer. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. The news of Sluys reached Paris slowly, and when it did, no one dared tell King Philip. The disaster was so complete, so humiliating, that courtiers feared the king's wrath. Finally, Philip's court jester, the only man allowed to speak uncomfortable truths, broke the news in the only way he could. "The English are cowards," the jester announced. "How so?" asked Philip. "Because," the fool replied, "they don't even have the guts to jump into the sea in full armour like our brave Frenchmen." The joke cut deep because it was true. French knights had drowned by the hundreds, pulled under by their own armour as their ships sank beneath them. Philip reportedly flew into a rage, but there was nothing to be done. His fleet was gone. His invasion plan was ashes. England was safe. Edward commemorated his victory by minting a gold coin showing himself on a ship, sword in hand, the first English gold coin in over 200 years. He had proved that England could challenge France not just on land, but at sea. The 100 Years' War would continue for another 113 years, but it would be fought almost entirely on French soil. Sluys ensured that. The strategic consequences were enormous. With French naval power broken, Edward could transport armies to France whenever he chose. 6 years later, his longbowmen would prove equally devastating on land at the Battle of Crécy, destroying the flower of French chivalry. 10 years after that, the Black Prince would capture the French king himself at Poitiers. All of this was made possible because Sluys gave England command of the sea. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. Before Sluys, many believed French military power was overwhelming, that Edward's claim to the French throne was delusional ambition. After Sluys, everything changed. England had destroyed a fleet twice its size. English archers had proved they could massacre enemies at ranges where crossbows couldn't reply. The myth of French invincibility was shattered before it had properly formed. Sluys also demonstrated something that would define English military thinking for centuries. Sea power matters. An island nation that controls the seas around it cannot be invaded. Edward didn't build on this lesson. He let his fleet decay after the battle, and French raiders eventually returned to England's coasts. But the principle was established. Britain's future lay in ruling the waves. Yet Sluys is largely forgotten today. Ask most people about medieval naval battles and you'll get blank looks. Crécy, Agincourt, Poitiers. The land battles of the 100 Years' War are famous. Sluys, which made them all possible, is barely remembered. Perhaps because naval battles lack the romance of cavalry charges. Perhaps because 16,000 Frenchmen drowning in a harbour doesn't fit the chivalric narrative we prefer. But Sluys deserves its place alongside Trafalgar and the Armada as one of England's greatest naval victories. The harbour at Sluys silted up centuries ago. The great port that once sheltered 200 warships is now farmland, miles from the sea. Modern Sluys is a quiet Dutch town with little to suggest that here, in 1340, the greatest naval battle of the medieval world was fought. There's no grand monument, no annual commemoration, just fields where water once ran red with French blood. But the consequences of Sluys echoed through centuries. The battle established a pattern. England challenging continental powers through naval superiority that would repeat against Spain in 1588, against France again under Napoleon, against Germany in 2 world wars. When Nelson fell at Trafalgar, he was fighting in a tradition that began here, in these waters, when Edward III's longbowmen turned a merchant fleet into a weapon of annihilation. The 100 Years' War would grind on until 1453, bringing sieges, plagues, and suffering to both nations. England would eventually lose its French possessions, everything except Calais, and the dream of a united Anglo-French crown would die. But for one glorious day in June 1340, England proved it could defeat the greatest power in Europe, not through cavalry charges or sieges, but through the disciplined firepower of common archers and the courage of a king who led from the front. Within 6 years, Edward would win at Crécy. Within 10, his son would capture the French king. Within a century, Henry V would conquer half of France. But it all began here, at Sluys, where the longbow first proved its terrible power and England first claimed mastery of the sea. That's what makes Sluys matter. Not just the tactics or the casualties, but what it represented. The birth of English naval power. The first great victory of a war that would last generations. And proof that an island nation with superior firepower and courageous leadership could defeat enemies who outnumbered it 2-1. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the forgotten battles, the origins of national greatness, the moments when arrows and courage changed the world, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other forgotten medieval battles should we uncover? Crécy and Agincourt get all the glory, but which overlooked victories shaped England's destiny? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.